Boy returns from death, and Jesus revealed the truth about the mark of the beast. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon in a quiet Midwestern town, the kind of day where the air smells sweet and the birds sing melodies that seem to melt your worries away. 12-year-old Ethan was outside, laughing with his friends, the carefree joy of childhood written across his face. His mother, watching from the porch, smiled as she sipped her iced tea, her heart warmed by the simple pleasure of seeing her boy happy. Ethan was the kind of kid who always seemed to have boundless energy. He raced up the slide, climbed the monkey bars, and leaped from one obstacle to the next like he was invincible. The group of boys had invented a new game that day, who could jump from the jungle gym to the ground in the most daring way. Ethan was, of course, the bravest among them. "Watch this!" he called out, his voice full of excitement, his brown eyes sparkling with mischief. He climbed to the highest point of the jungle gym, his friends cheering him on below. Ethan's mother called out to him from the porch, "Be careful, honey." Her voice had that instinctive tremor that only a mother can feel. But Ethan, like so many kids his age, believed he was untouchable. He waved at her and yelled back, "Don't worry, Mom. I got this." He bent his knees, preparing for the leap. The world seemed to pause for a moment. The birds stopped singing. Even the wind held its breath. And then he jumped. For a second, he was weightless, soaring like a bird. But something went wrong. His foot caught the edge of the jungle gym, and instead of landing gracefully on the ground, Ethan's body twisted mid-air. The sound of his head hitting the concrete echoed through the playground, sharp and sickening. Time seemed to freeze. His friends stared in stunned silence, their laughter dying instantly. Ethan's body lay still, so still, in a way no child's body should ever lie. His mother's glass of iced tea shattered on the porch as it slipped from her trembling hand. She sprinted across the yard, screaming his name, her voice breaking with a panic so raw it sent shivers down the spine of everyone who heard it. "Ethan! Ethan!" she cried, collapsing to her knees beside him. His skin was pale, his eyes closed, and his chest wasn't moving. Her hands trembled as she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for any sign of life. Nothing. No pulse. Tears streamed down her face as she called 911, her voice barely coherent through her sobs. "Please, you have to hurry. My son, he's not breathing. Please!" The minutes that followed felt like hours. The neighborhood gathered, silent and helpless, as they watched paramedics arrive. They worked desperately to revive him. Chest compressions, a defibrillator. The steady mechanical tone of the heart monitor, flat and unchanging. One of the paramedics shook his head, his expression grim. "There's no pulse," he muttered to his partner. But they didn't stop trying. They couldn't, not with a mother on her knees, praying aloud, begging God to save her son. "Lord, please, don't take him from me. Not my baby, not Ethan." And then, just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ethan's body, his tiny, lifeless body, grew cold. But Ethan wasn't there anymore. The moment his head hit the ground, Ethan later said, he felt himself leave his body. It wasn't gradual, it was instant. One moment, he was on the playground, surrounded by the familiar sounds of his friends and his mother, and the next, everything was silent. He tried to move, to speak, but his voice was gone, his limbs unresponsive. It was as if he were floating, untethered. And then the world around him began to change. The bright blue sky dissolved into an endless inky blackness. He couldn't tell if he was moving or if the darkness itself was swallowing him whole. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him from every side. At first, he thought it was just a dream. Maybe he had hit his head, and this was just what it felt like to be unconscious. But then he saw them. Shadows. Not just shadows, but faces. Twisted, contorted faces, their mouths open as if they were screaming, but no sound came out. Their eyes burned into him, and each one seemed to carry a terrible weight of pain and despair. The faces began to surround him, closing in, their hollow mouths moving in unison. Though they made no sound, Ethan could feel the words in his very soul. "It's too late. Too late. Too late," they whispered, over and over, each word like ice piercing his heart. He tried to turn away, but everywhere he looked, there were more faces. They weren't just strangers either. He recognized some of them, teachers, neighbors, even a friend from school who had passed away the year before. Each of them had something etched into their foreheads, glowing faintly in the darkness. It was a number, 3 numbers, 6, 6, 6. Ethan's heart, or whatever part of him still existed, began to race. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "It's too late! It's too late!" And then, just when he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, a new sound broke through. A voice, strong, commanding, yet full of an indescribable warmth. "Enough!" The darkness recoiled as if afraid, and a light, a blinding golden light, began to grow in the distance. Ethan felt himself being pulled toward it, away from the shadows, away from the faces, away from the whispers. And as the light enveloped him, he saw him. But Ethan wasn't ready for what would come next, because what awaited him on the other side was a truth more powerful and more terrifying than anything he had ever known. As the light grew stronger, Ethan felt the crushing weight of fear and despair lift from his soul. The warmth of the radiance was unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't just light, it was life. It surrounded him, filling every corner of the void, chasing away the shadows that had threatened to consume him. Ethan tried to focus, to understand where he was, but the brilliance was almost too much for his eyes. And then, out of the light, a figure emerged, tall, commanding, and cloaked in a white so pure it seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. The figure's face was gentle yet impossibly powerful, his eyes piercing but full of love, a love so deep it seemed to speak directly to Ethan's heart. He didn't need to ask who this was. Somehow, he knew. "Jesus," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and though his expression was serene, Ethan could feel the gravity of the moment. Jesus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and the boy felt an overwhelming surge of peace wash over him, as if all the pain, fear, and confusion he had ever felt had been erased in an instant. "Do not be afraid," Jesus said, his voice both soft and commanding, like a melody and a thunderclap rolled into one. Ethan could barely hold back tears. He felt so small, so unworthy, but in that moment, he also felt more loved than he ever thought possible. I don't understand," Ethan stammered. "Am I dead?" Jesus' gaze was steady, compassionate. "You have been brought here for a purpose," he said. "There is something you must see, something you must know, so that you may warn others. But do not be afraid. I am with you." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, the light around them began to shift. Shapes started to form, figures, landscapes, and structures, but they were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. He was no longer in the void, but neither was he in the world he knew. The ground beneath him shimmered like glass, reflecting colors that didn't seem to exist on Earth. In the distance, he could see mountains, rivers, and cities, but they were surreal, almost dreamlike. Jesus gestured toward a path that appeared before them, glowing faintly. "Walk with me," he said. Ethan followed, his bare feet touching the smooth, glowing surface of the path. As they walked, the scenery began to change. The vibrant landscapes dimmed, and the warmth of the light faded, replaced by a chilling, oppressive atmosphere. Ethan shivered as they came to the edge of a vast, barren wasteland. The ground was cracked and dry, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jesus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, and suddenly the scene around them came to life. Ethan saw people, hundreds, thousands of them, walking in single-file lines. They were pale and lifeless, their eyes empty, their heads bowed as they shuffled forward. On their foreheads, glowing faintly, was a number. Ethan didn't need to look twice to recognize it. 666. He turned to Jesus, his voice trembling. "What are they doing? Where are they going?" Jesus' expression was somber. "They are following the path they chose," he said, "the path of deception. They believe they are walking toward salvation, but they are walking toward destruction." Ethan's stomach churned as he watched the endless lines of people. Their faces were a mix of hopelessness and desperation, as if they had once realized their mistake but were now powerless to turn back. He wanted to cry out to them, to warn them, but his voice caught in his throat. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, Jesus raised his hand again, and the scene changed. Ethan found himself standing in the middle of a bustling city. The streets were lined with towering screens, each displaying bright, colorful messages. People were gathered in groups, laughing, cheering, and celebrating as they looked up at the screens. Ethan strained to see what they were looking at, and his heart sank. The screens were advertising something, a mark, a symbol that promised freedom, prosperity, and eternal security. The people flocked to clinics and booths set up along the streets, eagerly rolling up their sleeves or holding out their hands to receive the mark. "They're happy," Ethan said, confused. "They don't look scared. They don't even look evil." Jesus nodded solemnly. "The greatest deception is one that looks like truth," he said. "They believe this mark will save them, that it will give them everything they desire. But in accepting it, they are rejecting the one thing that truly matters, me." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to believe that the people were just mistaken, that they didn't understand what they were doing, but deep down he knew the truth. They chose this. They chose comfort over faith, security over trust in God. And now they were walking straight into the arms of the beast. "Why are you showing me this?" Ethan asked, tears streaming down his face. Jesus turned to him, his eyes filled with a deep, unshakable love. "Because you must warn them," he said. "There is still time. Many will hear and believe. But the hour is growing late, and the beast is already at work." Before Ethan could respond, Jesus raised his hand one final time. The scene shifted again, and Ethan found himself standing in a vast library. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with books that glowed faintly in the dim light. Jesus led him to a single book, larger and brighter than the rest. "This is the book of life," Jesus said, opening it to a page filled with names written in a radiant golden script. Ethan scanned the names, his heart pounding as he recognized some of them. Family members, friends, even strangers from his town. But then his eyes stopped on a name that seemed to glow brighter than the rest. "Baron Trump," he whispered. Jesus nodded. "A pivotal figure in the battle ahead," he said. "Pray for him. Pray for all who will rise unexpectedly in the fight. They will need strength, wisdom, and faith to withstand the trials to come." Ethan's mind raced. Why Baron Trump? How could a boy like him be connected to all of this? But before he could ask, the light around him began to fade. The warmth of Jesus' presence lingered, but Ethan felt himself being pulled away, back toward the void. "Wait!" he cried out. "I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" Jesus' voice echoed gently as the darkness began to return. Trust me, Ethan. You have seen the truth. Now go and share it. I am with you always." And with that, everything went black. Ethan's eyes flew open with a sudden, violent gasp, his lungs greedily sucking in air as though they had been starved of it for hours. The paramedics, who had all but given up, froze in stunned silence. One of them, a man with years of experience, muttered under his breath, "That's impossible." Ethan's mother, who had been crumpled on the ground in prayer, looked up with tears streaking her face. When she saw her son's chest rise and fall, she let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. "Ethan!" she cried, scrambling to his side and wrapping him in her arms, as if she would never let him go again. Her hands trembled as she stroked his hair, her voice breaking. "Oh, my baby, my sweet boy, you're alive! You're alive!" The paramedics were already moving, checking his vitals, calling in the miraculous development to the hospital. But Ethan, he barely noticed them. He wasn't quite sure where he was, or even who he was for a moment. The last thing he remembered was the radiant warmth of Jesus' hand on his shoulder and the thunderous command to trust. Now his body felt heavy, the world dull and muted compared to the place he had just been. Everything was wrong here, the air, the light, the sounds. But what struck him most was the lingering sense of urgency pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. He had been brought back for a reason. He couldn't forget that. "Mom," he croaked, his voice raspy and weak. She pulled back slightly, her hands cupping his face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. You're safe now." But Ethan shook his head. "No," he whispered, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "It's not safe. None of us are." His mother frowned, confused and worried, but before she could press him for more, the paramedics insisted on loading him into the ambulance. "Let's get him to the hospital," one of them said, his voice filled with awe. "Whatever just happened, we need to make sure he's stable." The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and hushed voices, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He closed his eyes and saw them again. The endless lines of people, the glowing numbers, the radiant book, and that name, Baron Trump. He had so much to say, so much he needed to warn them about, but he didn't know where to begin. His chest ached with the weight of it. At the hospital, doctors flooded the room, running tests and asking questions. They couldn't make sense of it. A boy with no pulse for what seemed like an eternity didn't just wake up. Not without brain damage, not without any signs of trauma. Yet here Ethan was, alive, alert, and more troubled than they could understand. When the doctors finally left, his mother sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. She hadn't let go since the ambulance ride, as if afraid he might slip away again if she loosened her grip. "Ethan," she said softly, brushing his hair from his face. "What happened out there? What do you mean it's not safe?" Ethan hesitated. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But he also knew he couldn't keep what he had seen to himself. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling. I saw him. I saw Jesus." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, her lips trembling as she tried to process what he was saying. "Jesus?" she echoed. "What do you mean you saw him?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I was gone, Mom. I died, but he brought me back. He showed me things I have to tell people about, things about the mark of the beast, about what's coming." His mother blinked rapidly, tears spilling down her cheeks. She didn't know what to say. She had always been a woman of faith, but hearing this from her own son, her son who had just been dead, shook her to her core. What did he show you?" she whispered. Ethan's voice was barely audible as he recounted the visions, the faces in the darkness, the numbers, the people lining up for the mark, the radiant book. He spoke of the peace he felt in Jesus' presence and the sorrow that weighed on him as he witnessed the deception consuming the world. By the time he finished, his mother was sobbing, clutching her son as though her very life depended on it. "We have to tell people," Ethan said, his voice stronger now. "They need to know what's coming. They need to know how dangerous it is to trust in anything but God." Word of Ethan's experience spread quickly. At first, it was just family and close friends who came to visit him in the hospital, drawn by his story. But soon, it seemed like the whole town had heard. People began gathering in the hospital waiting room, hoping to hear Ethan's testimony. His pastor visited, sitting at his bedside for hours, listening with wide eyes and a heavy heart. "What you're saying lines up with Scripture," the pastor said quietly, after Ethan finished. "It's in Revelation, the mark of the beast, the deception, the falling away. God must have brought you back for a reason, Ethan." The boy nodded. "I just don't know how to make people understand. They're not going to believe me." But they did believe him. The sincerity in his voice, the depth of emotion in his eyes, it was impossible to fake. People left his hospital room shaken, moved, and inspired. They began sharing his story, and soon Ethan was the talk of the entire community. Even those who had strayed from their faith began to pray again, wondering if Ethan's miraculous experience was a sign that they needed to prepare for something greater. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, Ethan would stare at the ceiling, replaying the vision of Baron Trump's name glowing in the Book of Life. He couldn't shake it. What did it mean? Why had Jesus shown it to him? He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, as though this mystery was something he was meant to solve. But for now, he could only pray. Pray for guidance. Pray for strength. Pray for the world. "Lord," he whispered one night, tears slipping down his cheeks, "I don't know why you chose me, but I'll do whatever you ask. Just help me make them listen." Ethan sat on his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling long after the lights had been dimmed for the night. The sounds of nurses' footsteps and distant monitors filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. That name, Baron Trump, echoed over and over in his thoughts, refusing to let him rest. Why had Jesus shown it to him? What role did Baron play in all of this? He tried to imagine Baron Trump, a boy he had only seen in the news or heard people talk about. Ethan had never paid much attention to politics or world leaders, but now that boy's face was burned into his mind. Was Baron like him, just a kid living his life, unaware of the bigger plans God might have for him? Or did he already know? Did Baron somehow sense the storm that was coming? The idea filled Ethan with both awe and unease. The next morning, Ethan told his pastor about the name he had seen in the Book of Life. The older man leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought, as Ethan described the glowing letters and Jesus' words, "A pivotal figure in the battle ahead." "Baron Trump," the pastor repeated, as though tasting the name on his tongue. "It's unexpected, isn't it? But God often works in ways we don't understand." "What do you think it means?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Is he supposed to do something important? Or is he in danger?" The pastor let out a deep breath, his face thoughtful. "It's hard to say, Ethan, but what's clear is that God has given you this vision for a reason. Whether it's to pray for Baron, to prepare for something involving him, or to share this message with the world, we must trust that the purpose will reveal itself in time." Ethan nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than he could understand, bigger than he could handle. But then he remembered Jesus' words, "I am with you, always." That thought steadied him, giving him the strength to keep moving forward. As news of Ethan's experience continued to spread, more and more people reached out to hear his story. Some were skeptical, dismissing him as just a kid with a vivid imagination. But others, many others, were deeply moved. They saw in Ethan's words the warnings they had read about in Scripture but had never taken seriously. His story reignited a sense of urgency in their faith, a reminder that the time to prepare wasn't tomorrow but today. Among the visitors to Ethan's home after he was discharged from the hospital were strangers who had traveled hours, even days, just to meet him. They brought gifts, asked for his prayers, and begged to know more about what he had seen. Ethan tried his best to answer, but the truth was, he didn't have all the answers himself. He only knew what Jesus had shown him, and he knew that it was real. One evening, as his family sat together in the living room, Ethan turned to his father. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "do you think it's crazy to believe Baron Trump could be important? Like really important?" His father, a practical man who rarely spoke about faith, looked at him for a long moment. "I don't think anything is crazy anymore," he said finally. "Not after what happened to you." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But if God put his name in front of you, then there's a reason for it. Maybe it's not for us to understand right now. Maybe we're just supposed to pray and be ready." Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to trust. The weeks that followed were transformative, not just for Ethan but for the entire community. Churches that had once been half empty were now overflowing with people eager to reconnect with their faith. Bible study groups sprang up in living rooms and prayer chains grew longer by the day. Ethan's story had lit a fire in people's hearts, reminding them of what truly mattered. But with that newfound faith came an undercurrent of fear. People whispered about the mark of the beast, about the visions Ethan had described. Some were certain the end times were upon them. Others clung to hope, believing they could stand strong against whatever trials lay ahead. Ethan, for his part, tried to focus on the hope. He remembered the light in Jesus' eyes, the warmth of his presence, and the assurance in his voice when he said, "Trust me." That trust became Ethan's anchor, even as the weight of his vision threatened to overwhelm him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blazed with hues of orange and gold, Ethan stood outside with his mother. They watched the sky in silence, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, his mother broke the silence. "You've changed, Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with both pride and sorrow. "You're not the same boy you were before the accident." "I'm not," Ethan admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't think I ever will be. But maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm not supposed to be the same." His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I just want you to know how proud I am of you, and no matter what happens, no matter where this leads, I'll always be here for you." Tears pricked Ethan's eyes, but he smiled. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, or why Baron Trump's name had been shown to him, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. And whatever lay ahead, he would face it with faith, courage, and the unwavering belief that God's plan was greater than anything he could imagine. For now, that was enough.